April 1942, Smolensk Oblast, German-occupied Soviet territory. The administrative building on Klinger Street had survived the Wehrmacht's advance with its walls intact, but its purpose transformed. The upper floor now serving as a processing center, where Major Hans-Ulrich von Boss of the Abwehr 2 section reviewed dossiers under the light of a kerosene lamp that cast shifting shadows across photographs of captured Red Army personnel, men whose uniforms still bore the mud and cordite residue of recent battles fought along the Vyazma salient, where Army Group Center had crushed Soviet counteroffensives and left tens of thousands dead or missing in the spring Rasputitsa that turned the roads to rivers of black sludge. Von Voss adjusted his spectacles and studied the face of former Lieutenant Pyotr Tavrin, captured near Zhev in February, a tank commander whose T-34 had taken a round from an 88mm flak gun that killed his crew but left him unconscious in the snow until a patrol from the 9th Infantry Division found him 14 hours later, suffering from hypothermia and a fractured collarbone. The interrogation transcripts indicated political disillusionment, resentment toward commissars who'd executed his cousin in the 1937 purges, and a pragmatic desire to survive, qualities that made him a candidate for what Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris had begun calling Operation Zeppelin, a program designed to recruit Soviet defectors and turncoats who'd be trained, equipped, and infiltrated back behind Red Army lines to conduct sabotage, assassination, and reconnaissance operations that conventional Wehrmacht intelligence networks could not achieve. The concept had originated in discussions at Führer headquarters in Rostenburg during the winter crisis when Soviet counterattacks nearly broke the German front, when panic had briefly seized the high command and desperate measures seemed justified, when someone, von Voss never learned who, suggested that the vast pool of Soviet prisoners, over 3 million men starving in transit camps and stockades across occupied territory, represented not merely a logistical burden, but a potential weapon if the right individuals could be identified, turned, and deployed. The selection criteria were specific: former officers or NCOs with combat experience, men who demonstrated tactical competence, men whose loyalty to Stalin had been shattered by personal grievance or ideological conversion, men who could pass as authentic Red Army personnel because they were authentic, merely repurposed. Von Voss had processed 43 candidates since February and approved 9 for training at the facility near Minsk, where former Soviet instructors taught German intelligence officers the intricacies of NKVD protocols, Red Army communications procedures, and the passwords that changed weekly across different fronts. Tavrin's dossier noted that he spoke fluent German, learned during a pre-war technical exchange with the Weimar Republic's clandestine armored training program at Kazan, and that he had requested a meeting with Abwehr representatives 3 days after his capture, offering detailed information about Soviet tank deployment patterns around Zhev in exchange for better rations and removal from the general prisoner population, where typhus had killed 600 men in a single week. The offer alone did not guarantee recruitment. Many prisoners provided intelligence simply to improve their immediate circumstances, but follow-up interrogations conducted by Captain Werner Janke had revealed something deeper: a cold calculation in Tavrin's responses, an absence of the performative defiance that characterized most captured officers, a willingness to discuss not just tactical minutiae, but strategic failures in Soviet command structure, the incompetence of political officers, the suicidal orders issued during the winter offensive that sent entire regiments into German machine gun positions without adequate artillery preparation or winter clothing. Von Voss made a notation in the margin of the dossier recommending Tavrin for Phase 2 evaluation, which would involve polygraph examination, psychological assessment by SS Hauptsturmführer Erwin Schulz, who specialized in detecting embedded NKVD agents attempting to infiltrate German intelligence, and a final interview with Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, who would personally assess each candidate's operational potential before authorizing their transfer to the training facility. Outside the window, a Kübelwagen carrying SS personnel rattled past on the cobblestones, its engine noise momentarily drowning out the sound of a distant artillery barrage from the front lines 40 kilometers east, where the spring Rasputitsa had temporarily halted major operations, but where patrol actions continued nightly. Small, savage encounters in forests and villages that produced a steady stream of casualties and prisoners, the raw material for Operation Zeppelin's ambitious and morally catastrophic experiment in turning the Red Army's own soldiers against their motherland. An operation that would ultimately deploy hundreds of agents into Soviet territory with mixed results, some disappearing immediately upon insertion, some transmitting valuable intelligence for weeks before their capture and execution, some genuinely committed to their new German masters, others playing a double game whose true loyalties remained ambiguous even in the fragmentary records recovered after the war. August 1942, training facility Zeppelin Süd, near Orsha, German occupied by La Russia. The compound occupied a former NKVD rest facility, 12 kilometers from the main rail line, surrounded by birch forest and barbed wire, where 47 selected agents underwent intensive preparation in operations that would send them back across front lines, carrying forged documents, memorized codes, and carefully constructed cover stories designed to withstand the initial scrutiny of Soviet counterintelligence officers who routinely subjected returning soldiers to aggressive interrogation that assumed capture by Germans meant probable collaboration or cowardice, deserving a penal battalion assignment or execution. Tavrin stood in the mock interrogation room, while Hauptmann Dieter Kohl, fluent in Russian with 3 years' experience in Abwehr operations against the Soviet Union, repeated the same questions he had asked 17 times in the past 6 days. Questions about Tavrin's unit history, the names of his commanders, the location of his regiment during specific engagements in 1941, details that an NKVD interrogator would demand and cross-reference against incomplete records salvaged from retreating units and survivor testimonies that often contradicted each other in the chaos of the Wehrmacht's advance. The training regimen combined psychological conditioning with practical tradecraft, recognition of NKVD identification protocols, operation of Soviet radio equipment, including the RSBF transceiver that agents would carry concealed in provisions crates or ammunition boxes, cipher systems based on poems and numerical keys that changed according to predetermined schedules, dead-drop procedures for material too sensitive for radio transmission, and emergency exfiltration plans that acknowledged most agents would not survive long enough to require extraction. Tavrin had proven adept at the technical aspects, mastering the RSBF's quirks and demonstrating patient precision during cipher exercises. But Kohl remained concerned about psychological stability under the extreme stress of operating alone in Soviet territory, where discovery meant torture and public execution, where every interaction carried the risk of exposure, where the natural paranoia induced by living under Stalinist surveillance would be amplified by the agent's genuine guilt and the knowledge that former comrades would show no mercy if his true mission was discovered. The morning's exercise involved a simulated border crossing, where Tavrin approached a checkpoint manned by German personnel playing the role of Soviet guards, his papers identifying him as Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Voronov of the 114th Rifle Division, returning from German captivity after escaping from a transit camp near Smolensk, carrying wounds documentation and a fabricated story about 3 weeks traveling through forests, avoiding both German patrols and Soviet barrier troops who were known to shoot stragglers and deserters on sight. The Soviet guards subjected him to 2 hours of hostile interrogation, accused him of fascist sympathies, threatened him with summary execution, and finally approved his passage with orders to report to NKVD headquarters in the divisional rear area for formal debriefing. Exactly the outcome that would occur in reality, and the point at which an agent's real mission would begin. Establishing himself within Soviet military structure, gaining access to operational information, and transmitting intelligence back to Abwehr handlers monitoring radio frequencies from listening posts in occupied territory. Skorzeny had visited the facility in July and observed training exercises, his presence lending weight to the program's importance within the expanding constellation of special operations that included Brandenburg commando units and the various SS and SD intelligence networks that competed with traditional military intelligence for resources and Hitler's attention. The agents selected for Operation Zeppelin represented a particular category of asset, neither ideologically committed to National Socialism, nor mercenaries motivated purely by material reward, but rather men who had crossed an internal threshold where survival and pragmatism trumped patriotic loyalty. Men whose bitterness toward Soviet leadership, or whose terror of the prisoner camps, made collaboration seem rational. Men whose very authenticity as Soviet soldiers made them valuable precisely because they required no disguise, no pretense, merely a reorientation of purpose and loyalty that German handlers hoped would endure under operational stress. By August 1942, 17 agents had been deployed into Soviet territory through various insertion methods. Some crossed lines during fluid tactical situations, claiming to have escaped German capture. Others were landed by Heinkel 111 aircraft in remote areas with orders to make their way to assigned destinations. A few were infiltrated through partisan-controlled territories, posing as communist organizers sent from Moscow with coded authorizations that German forgers had created using captured NKVD templates. Results varied dramatically. Agent Oscar, former Captain Grigory Petrov, transmitted valuable intelligence about Red Army defensive preparations around Stalingrad for 3 weeks before his final message indicated imminent compromise and was never heard from again. Agent Bruno, former Senior Sergeant Ivan Kolesnik, was apparently arrested within 48 hours of crossing Soviet lines, his fate unknown, but presumed to involve execution after interrogation that would have revealed German operational methods. Agent Victor, former Lieutenant Andrei Volkov, successfully embedded himself in a rifle regiment's staff section and transmitted regular reports for 5 months, providing details on unit movements, morale assessments, and equipment shortages that helped German intelligence construct accurate order of battle assessments, before his transmission ceased in January 1943 under circumstances never determined. Tavrin completed his training in September and received final authorization from von Voss, who noted in the operational log that the candidate demonstrated acceptable technical proficiency and psychological stability, though reservations remained about his ultimate reliability under extended operational conditions, concerns that proved prescient when Tavrin crossed into Soviet territory on October 11, 1942, was detained by NKVD border troops within 6 hours, underwent intensive interrogation lasting 9 days, and made a decision that would define the remainder of his war and life. A choice between the Germans who had trained him and the Soviet state that had imprisoned and starved his former comrades. A choice whose full implications would only become clear in the fragmentary records that survived the war's end. November 1942. NKVD Directorate Building, Kaluga Oblast, Soviet Rear Area. The interrogation room occupied the basement level, where pipes carrying steam heat hissed and clanked through the early winter darkness, where Senior Lieutenant Boris Komarov of SMERSH counterintelligence reviewed the stenographic transcript of Tavrin's confession that detailed his capture near Rzhev, the conditions in German prisoner camps where thousands died weekly from starvation and typhus, his recruitment by Abwehr officers who promised food and survival in exchange for cooperation, the training facility near Orsha, where 47 Soviet defectors learned cipher systems and radio operation, and the specific methods by which German intelligence intended to penetrate Red Army security. information that Komarov found both damning and tactically valuable because it exposed the scope of Operation Zeppelin's ambitions and the specific vulnerabilities German handlers believed existed in Soviet counterintelligence procedures. Tavrin sat across the wooden table, hands cuffed, face hollowed by interrogation stress and the uncertainty of his fate, knowing that voluntary confession offered no guarantee of mercy in a system where collaboration with the enemy typically resulted in execution, regardless of circumstances or subsequent cooperation with Soviet authorities. Komarov had conducted this type of interrogation 43 times since SMERSH was established in April 1943, with the specific mandate to uncover German agents, deserters, and collaborators within Red Army ranks. But Operation Zeppelin cases were particularly complex because the agents were genuine Soviet citizens with legitimate military records whose cover stories were essentially true except for the crucial element of their current loyalties and mission objectives, making detection dependent not on identifying forged documents or inconsistent histories, but on subtle indicators of psychological stress, unusual knowledge, or behavioral patterns that suggested clandestine activity. The decision facing Komarov involved recommendation to his superiors about Tavrin's disposition, immediate execution as a traitor, assignment to a penal battalion where survival expectations averaged 3 weeks during major offensives, or potential utilization as a double agent who would transmit disinformation to German handlers while providing Soviet intelligence with insights into Abwehr operational methods and current intelligence priorities. The latter option carried significant risk because if Tavrin's transformation from German agent to Soviet asset was itself a deception, if his confession was calculated to gain trust before resuming his original mission, then the entire counterintelligence effort could be compromised, false confidence could lead to operational failures, and German intelligence would gain access to information about Soviet security procedures that would endanger other investigations. Tavrin's testimony included details that could be verified through other sources, the location of the training facility that Soviet partisans could potentially locate and attack, the names of German officers involved in the program who appeared in existing intelligence files, descriptions of technical equipment that matched captured German radio transmitters, procedural details about insertion methods that corresponded to interrogation reports from other suspected agents who had been captured in recent months along various sectors of the front. The political context made Tavrin's case particularly delicate because Stalin had issued orders in July 1942 designating all Soviet personnel who allowed themselves to be captured as traitors to the motherland, a policy that made no distinction between soldiers who surrendered voluntarily and those captured while unconscious or wounded. A blanket condemnation that reflected the regime's paranoia about internal security and its determination to prevent any perception that collaboration with the enemy might offer a path to survival, though the practical application of this policy varied depending on individual circumstances, the personality of the interrogating officers, and the potential intelligence value of the prisoner. Komarov noted in his report that Tavrin's decision to confess immediately upon detention before enhanced interrogation methods were employed suggested either genuine remorse and desire to rejoin Soviet service or sophisticated calculation that early cooperation would establish credibility for a deeper deception, and that distinguishing between these possibilities required extended observation under controlled conditions where behavioral patterns could be monitored and analyzed. The broader implications of Operation Zeppelin extended beyond individual cases like Tavrin's because the program represented a systematic attempt to weaponize the massive prisoner population that German forces had captured during the first 18 months of the war. Men who were dying in vast numbers from starvation and disease in camps where rations were deliberately inadequate and medical care non-existent. Conditions that created desperation and vulnerability that German intelligence sought to exploit by offering survival in exchange for betrayal.
a calculus that succeeded in recruiting hundreds of agents, though the operational effectiveness of the program remained uncertain, given the high rate of immediate detection and execution upon Soviet re-entry, and the unknown number of agents who successfully transmitted intelligence for extended periods before being compromised, or who made their own decisions about loyalty once they had crossed back into Soviet territory and confronted the reality of operating against their own people. Tavrin's fate was ultimately decided in December 1942 when Komarov's superiors approved a proposal to use him as a double agent, calculating that his technical knowledge of German radio procedures and his credible cover story as a returnee from German captivity made him valuable despite the risks, a decision that led to 18 months of carefully orchestrated radio communications in which Tavrin transmitted disinformation about Soviet defensive positions and fictitious intelligence about planned offensives, while Komarov's team analyzed German responses to determine what intelligence priorities they had for information about current operations and what operational plans their requests for specific information might indicate. The transmissions continued through the winter of 1943, through the Stalingrad victory that destroyed the German Sixth Army and shifted strategic momentum irrevocably toward the Red Army, through the summer battles around Kursk, where Soviet intelligence successfully anticipated the German offensive partially through information provided by agents like Tavrin, whose double-agent operations gave Soviet planners insights into German reconnaissance priorities, and finally ceased in June 1944 when German forces abandoned the listening post that had been receiving Tavrin's transmissions, the entire network collapsing as the Wehrmacht retreated westward under the pressure of Operation Bagration that destroyed Army Group Center and liberated Belarus, where the training facility near Orsha was overrun by Soviet forces who found fragmentary records documenting Operation Zeppelin's scope and the identities of some agents who had been deployed, information that triggered additional counterintelligence investigations and summary executions of suspected collaborators in the chaotic advance across formerly occupied territories, where the line between victim and collaborator, between survival and betrayal, between coerced cooperation and willing treason remained impossibly blurred in the moral wreckage of total war.